Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Rounding up the bad guys, locking them up or making them benefit society in their new lives. We're not talking crooks here, but carbon. Catching emissions before they reach the atmosphere. Expensive, difficult, but it could well be a big part of the answer to the climate crisis. This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The big ambition in the fight against climate change is getting to no overall carbon emissions by the middle of this century. It's going to take all kinds of solutions, and we're looking at some of them here on Roundtable. For the first in our new series, Net Zero, carbon capture, a controversial idea, but big companies are standing by to invest billions in it.
73 countries have committed to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And as those emissions continue to rise at a rapid rate, capturing some of them from the air could help tackle climate change. Carbon capture and storage is a technology that captures CO2 and stores it underground, or converts it into raw material for fertilizers or building supplies. It's happening in power stations in Canada, the US and UK, and in the industrial sector in the United Arab Emirates, and storage applications in Iceland. According to the Global Carbon Institute, carbon capture storage is the only clean technology capable of decarbonizing major industry, and is the key to achieving net zero emissions across the energy system. But its critics say the huge investment needed would be better spent on developing clean energy. So is carbon capture the right technology to fight the climate crisis?
And we say hello to, in Massachusetts, USA, Jennifer Wilcox, Professor of Chemical Engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. We travel to Paris next. And Sara Budinis, Energy Analyst at the International Energy Agency. With me in the studio, Eric Lounsbury, Director of the Carbon Trust, and Andree Frieze, Green Party Councillor for Richmond here in London. We're going to hear quite a lot in this programme, I suspect, about CCUs and CCS. The U standing for utilisation, the S for sequestration. Sequestration being basically capturing it, putting it underground, and utilisation, using it. That makes some sense. Now, we're going to try and get through this without getting too technical. Sara, let me come to you first of all. Carbon capture, whether it's utilisation or sequestration, is that the answer to net zero?
It is one of the answers of the net zero. We know that in order to reach net zero, we need a full portfolio of decarbonization options, which means we need carbon capture and storage, but also energy and material efficiency, and also fuel switching and electrification as well of the demand for energy. I think what's important to point out here is the unique role of carbon capture and storage, which can decarbonize, for instance, existing asset, which means existing plant, for instance, power generation, electricity generation plants in Asia, which are quite young. They are around, average age is 12 years old. And these plants are not going to be decommissioned anytime soon because their lifetime is 40 years, which means who has invested in them want to see a return. And you can reduce their emission using carbon capture and storage. And the same is for challenging to decarbonize sectors such as the manufacturing sector, where it's not always easy to change completely a process to make it more sustainable. It's not always possible to move, for instance, from fossil fuels to biomass-based fuel, because the fuel is also one of the raw material of the process. And it's difficult to reach very high temperatures, which are needed using only electricity.
OK, I want to talk a little bit about how it is stored. And Jennifer, I'll come to you about that one. I mean, I know it's a difficult job and there are so many aspects to it, but what would be the most popular way of capturing it and storing it?
The most popular way of capturing is really, in the United States, we have a pretty solid success project called Petronova, which uses amine scrubbing, and it's capturing CO2 from a coal-fired power plant. It's able to capture about 1.4 million tons of CO2 per year, and then ultimately storing that into a geologic formation in the Permian Basin in Texas. And it does that through enhanced oil recovery. but ultimately the CO2 is stored. And globally today, we have about 40 million tons of CO2 that's stored every year, with most of that stored through enhanced oil recovery.
Okay, so let me try and simplify this, and do tell me if I've got it slightly wrong, but the CO2 is pumped underground into empty oil wells and then helps bring up any remaining oil or perhaps gas that is there. So it eventually, presumably, it escapes again, doesn't it?
So absolutely the way that it's done today, enhanced oil recovery, if you look at the life cycle of the oil that you're recovering, it takes energy to do that. You have to refine it, you have to transport it, and then ultimately we burn the oil or fuel in an internal combustion engine, which puts CO2 back in the atmosphere. But if the CO2 is sourced from the atmosphere and we maximize the amount of CO2 that's in the earth, for instance, today the historical number is 0.5 ton of CO2 stored per barrel of oil produced. So if we could increase that to 1 or 2 even, then we could ultimately, again, if the CO2 is sourced from air, we could ultimately have something that could even approach neutral.
Okay, so it's a form of recycling, if you like. You're using the CO2 again and again for a particular end. But Eric, I mean, one particular thing you've been looking at is using carbon dioxide in concrete, in cement. How does that work? Because I don't know whether that's storing it because it's inside the cement, or whether, in fact, it's using it because at some point the cement's going to degrade and it's going to come out.
Well, there's the potential for both. As Sara mentioned, cement is definitely one of those hard to decarbonize sectors, in part because part of the process is not just about energy. In fact, 2/3 of the emissions are from the calcination process, which is a chemical process where CO2 is released as you produce cement. We've been working on a project as part of a consortium in Belgium with Heidelberg Cement at their plant there to try a novel way to capture that 2/3 of the emissions that result from the production of cement, and to capture that in a very cost-effective way that hasn't been done before. So use is also important. It can strengthen the cement itself by infusing the concrete with cement.
And presumably there's so much cement concrete used in the world. I mean, this would be a great way of storing a vast amount of CO2, or not?
It's one of the biggest possible utilization markets, alongside a few others that we've talked about, use in plastics production, also in things like fuels, which we'll come on to, is another major usage market. I think it's important to keep in mind, though, that those utilization markets, while fairly large, are nowhere near the total scale of the amount of CO2 that we need to capture and take out of the atmosphere.
What are we talking about? Like 1%, 2% that's happening at the moment, or the potential is 10%? So what do you do with the remaining 90 that's still out there? Is it like that?
It's of that order. There are differing estimates of how big the utilization markets might be. But to put the sequestration kind of numbers into context, I mean, you mentioned the net zero challenge, and certainly by 2050, we need to be down to zero. And I guess the even more difficult bit is that we have to be significantly negative in emissions in the second half of the century. And where is that going to come from? It could come from some of these technologies combined with bioenergy, or direct air capture, where you're pulling.
Well, we'll talk in a moment, if we can, about using CO2 to make liquid fuels. But I'm wondering about the Green Party's take on this. We're talking, what did I say, 1 to 2% or up to 10% or whatever. I mean, that's tinkering at the edges, or is it better than nothing?
One of the easiest ways of looking at it is if you consider that for every tonne of carbon that we burn, we put 3.7 tonnes of carbon dioxide into the air. So that's the sort of magnitude of what we're looking at. At the moment, the UK's emissions are 480 tonnes per year, million tonnes per year. And we are one of the things
I'm sorry to butt in, but numbers like that, I think, are lost on most people.
All right.
So tell me whether you think this is a good move, reusing it or locking it up forever and ever, or whether you think this is just PR, if you like.
I think it's a good move, but as most of the other people on the panel would say, it's part of a big mix. Yeah. And as well as doing carbon sequestration, we need to increase the land cover in the UK by 3 times as much as we have now. So we need to get to 17% land cover of trees, because the thing about the trees is not only do they suck the carbon in, but they produce oxygen for it, but they also improve the biodiversity in the UK. We have a species extinction going on. Yeah. We have a biodiversity loss that if we don't stop that, as well as the climate emergency that we have now, will probably die because of that rather than just because of climate chaos.
Do you want to hear Jennifer's plan? You'd like this one, which because you want to make toy forests, and I'm being very simplistic here, but synthetic forests.
Yeah, I mean, direct air capture is much more efficient than planting trees, but we're going to need everything. I mean, there's no silver bullet solution. Direct air capture is not a silver bullet solution. But it can be up to 100 times more efficient to use chemicals to take CO2 out of the atmosphere versus a forest. The trick is that you need to do something with the CO2 that permanently removes it from the atmosphere. Yeah. If you turn it into a fuel, the CO2 goes back in the air. The way to really remove it is putting it back in the geosphere, which is where the carbon came from to begin with. That's the largest scale of what...
By geosphere, you mean underground?
Underground.
Okay.
Permanent.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of storage capacity in the subsurface that could take care of our emissions for decades to hundreds of years. The synthetic aggregates or the concrete industry, as we talked before, actually does have the scale of gigatons potential in terms of CO2 utilization. I think the trick with that, though, is that process has to become very cheap, because the way that we make concrete today is using sand as a feedstock. So the question is how can you make a process as cheap as dirt, right? Because that's where concrete is coming from.
Sorry, I know you say this has been going on for decades. Are we making great advances now? Or is it just part of the conversation because it's part of the conversation?
I think the conversation has been shifting and changing, and this is really interesting to observe and be part of it. So, as you mentioned, yes, carbon capture has been done for decades now. There are 19 large scale which are currently operating and a number of smaller scales. And what's interesting to see is that so far, carbon capture has happened where there was a policy framework in place that was supporting it. So, for instance, in Norway, since 1991, they have a carbon tax which was enough to justify investing in carbon capture and storing carbon dioxide underground instead of releasing it into the atmosphere and then pay that tax. And it also happened in the United States through enhanced oil recovery, as Jennifer mentioned before, because the oil that was extracted was a clear source of revenue. And today we see more and more applications. So we see carbon capture and storage, as it was mentioned, in cement, but also like in ethanol, fertilizer, in a number of applications. Yeah. And also we see direct air capture, both for using this carbon dioxide, for instance, for carbonation of drinks, but also for storing it. For instance, the CarbFix project in Iceland is storing CO2 underground.
Talking of Iceland, it reminds me of the volcanoes they have up there, infamous volcanoes. But I was reading as part of this program that you can now turn carbon dioxide into something called anchorite if you inject it into basalt, which is part of volcanoes. And after a couple of years, instead of being a gas, it's a solid.
Yes, exactly. So, as it is phrased on the project website, they are turning carbon dioxide into rocks, and they claim to need only 2 years to do that, which is something really new.
Extraordinary. And Andree, you want to tell us a little bit about a project, because we've talked about the Porthos one, which is the Rotterdam one, where it's all going to be put into empty caverns, if you like, underneath the North Sea. But Acorn is what? This is a Scottish.
Yes, Acorn is a similar one. It's funded by the EU, and it's just been given a licence by the British government, and it's funded by the Scottish government as well. And it takes the existing oil fields, the existing natural gas fields that we have in the North Sea. They bring that on land. They then filter the hydrogen out of that, and the CO2 gets pushed back in the pipes, back into the old oil beds that are now empty or nearly empty in the North Sea.
And then you cap it?
No, the point is they're down beneath the... this is the bit where I'm not a scientist, I'm not a technical person. I'm sure one of the women here can probably do all that science bit.
OK, is that a sensible idea? Because it seems to me like if you put a hole in the top of a can, the air's going to get out. In this case, the CO2.
So there are a lot of different types of geologic storage sites in the world, and many of these ones that have been storing oil and gas for millions of years, those same trapping mechanisms that have been trapping oil and gas will be the ones that will trap CO2. Sometimes they're faults, sometimes they're low permeability cap rock that are made of clay and very small pore structures so that you can't get leakage. But typically, like for an enhanced oil recovery project, there's an injection well, and then there's a production well. And those are very well controlled, and they're capped when a project is complete.
Okay, we will come on to fuels in just a moment, if I may, but Eric's been sitting here quietly for some time. Listening to all of this, I'm beginning to wonder whether it's going to be possible at some time to have these synthetic forests or something similar, to have the underground storage capacities and to be able to have the technology simply to suck carbon dioxide out of the air so that it is no longer any more a problem. Is that possible?
Well, we know that the solutions we've been talking about are technically possible. We know that right now they're costly and not at huge scale. But it's also, there's a lot of promise that cost can come down and the scale can go up. Now, as we started the program saying, it's not the only solution, but we're going to need these solutions. The scale of the removals you're going to need to pull CO2 out of the air is pretty astonishing. So I think we talked about huge numbers of emissions now. It's similar order of magnitude to remove emissions.
But the difficulty is if you find a way of making it easy to remove it from the air, you find no reason to stop people having bad habits.
And this is
exactly. And I think the problem is that we can't wait for that. We can't wait for that technology to come on side. We also have the issue that you need to have the government supporting the risk on this, like they support the risk on nuclear. So the government's basically underwrite the risk on nuclear waste. Approach. Yeah, and the government has to underwrite the risk on this. And you can't, but at the same time, we cannot wait for these technologies to come online. We have to actually stop we have to stop the amount of fossil fuels that we're emitting in the first place. And we need to do that very swiftly. And we are, the UK has done a lot of work on that. Our energy system has been decarbonised by 60%. So we are now 60% based on renewable fuels and nuclear, which is included in that, but we still have 40% to go.
OK, let's go to a couple of the scientists. Jennifer, you first on this one. I made a note here about carbon-neutral fuels, which is supposedly the largest potential market, but very expensive because at the moment it's difficult electrolysing hydrogen, which is a vital part of this. Is that going to be the big answer to this, that we drive along in cars that are powered by, effectively, the thing that we're trying to stop them pushing out into the atmosphere at the moment, which is CO2?
Well, I mean, it also goes back to the fact that depending on the type of energy that you use to produce synthetic fuels, you just don't want to be emitting more CO2 through that process, because it is very energy intensive to split water with electricity. And it's also very expensive today. And so CO2 to fuels, again, too, is just going to be, at best, a neutral process that puts the CO2 back in the atmosphere. I think that there are also other ways to think about how we can get hydrogen. Already today, we know how to produce hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture. And so if there's a transition period where we're still depending, say, on natural gas because it's a more effective or cost-effective process, that could be another route to doing it rather than the costly and high-energy process of splitting water with electricity. OK,
so Sara, better to do it this way than not to do it at all, but at the same time you still end up with the problem of the fact that you are generating CO2. So I'm going to ask you again about making turbines in power generation more efficient by having what is known as a supercritical fluid. That's carbon dioxide heated and pressurized and then used much more efficiently. Again, is that simply what Jennifer is saying, a means of effectively recycling it, making it more efficient and not emitting quite so much CO2, or is that an answer?
Again, it can be one of the answers. This process is called, one example is called the Allam cycle, and as you said, is using supercritical CO2, which means CO2 at very high pressure to generate electricity. But again, the problem could be, okay, what do you do with this carbon dioxide once you have used it? And as it was mentioned before, most of it has to be stored underground. And I think this is the main message. Carbon capture and utilization and carbon capture and storage are both part of the solution, but it's important to have a storage site to store it underground.
Okay, so using less of it. Yeah, you wanted to say something, Andree. And then I'll come to you about something called negative emission technology. Yeah? Because negative's better than just a little bit.
I mean, trying to take it back to in a way that people understand that this has to be part of the mix of what we're doing. In Richmond, we declared a climate emergency. We had a conference last week discussing how...
Richmond being the borough you represent, which is in the west of London.
Yeah. Okay. And we've declared a climate emergency. We're now looking at how we can get to net zero by 2030. 50% of our emissions come from our homes. And our homes are generally heated by gas. There are 30 million gas boilers in homes in the UK. So we can't swiftly change those to hydrogen. We're not set up for that. So the problem is you have to find a way to continue heating our homes. We have to insulate our homes before you can get to the actual stage where we talk about carbon capture being the solution to our problems. So the development that's happening in Scotland, if they push, I think, just 2% of hydrogen from natural gas into the system, that will reduce the amount of CO2.
Now, what about negative emission technology? That means we could all get around in whatever way we see fit, and we would actually be producing negative emissions, perhaps helping the world.
Well, I think it's important to remember that getting around may be using energy, which hopefully is zero carbon. But in addition to that, we'll need some negative technology. So they won't necessarily be one and the same. So negative emissions is a pretty broad area in itself. We've already talked about trees, which is a nice naturally occurring way to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Other techniques like direct air capture are quite exciting, not funded hugely.
Which is effectively like a huge air filter.
It is like a gigantic air filter. Some of the projects that exist now, just imagine a box with tons of fans on them to capture as much air as they can and filtering out the very low concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's 400 parts per million, which is high compared to historical standards, of course, but low in sort of absolute terms. And so you pull that out and do something with it. Use it, bury it, and if you bury it, you've done negative emissions. You've taken the CO2 out of the atmosphere, put it back in the ground, and that's the kind of thing we're going to need to be doing at incredible scale over the next century.
So what does everybody think? We don't have very much time. I was sorry to shut you up on that one, Andree, but do you think we're getting somewhere with this?
Very slowly.
And we don't have loads of time.
We don't have loads of time. We don't have a lot of onshore wind farms because people think they look ugly. We've pushed them all offshore. If you have fields of these carbon capture things, I've seen them, they're not particularly attractive. We're going to have a lot of people going, I don't want to see those in my back on the hills over in the Peak District because they're ugly. So let's be clear. Yeah, let's be clear about this. These are all technical solutions to a problem that there are some really low-tech alternatives to, like our peatlands. Part of the reason why we're having the shocking floods that we've had in the last few weeks and people have lost their lives in the UK because of flooding is because we burn our peatlands, we let them dry out. We don't use peat. It sequesters so much carbon in it. That's one of the best things that we could do is just actually restore our peatlands.
Jennifer, and very briefly, Sara, is science the answer here?
So we need it all. We need the trees, we need the peatlands. We can do direct air capture today in the United States. We have one of the largest projects that just got supported by Occidental with carbon engineering that's building a plant in Texas that's capable of removing 1 million tons of CO2 per year. As I said before, we need to increase what we're doing in terms of storage back in the earth by 100 to 1,000 times what we're doing today in order to meet climate goals. We need to do negative emissions also on a very large scale, increasing the activity we have today, again, up to 1,000 times at least in the next decade.
OK, and I'm going to throw to Sara very quickly on this one. Last word from you. It's a problem that's being taken very seriously at the moment. Are we acting quickly enough?
I just want to go back to the question you asked before. It's like, do we need science?
Okay, well, you can answer that one, but it'll be the only one we've got time for.
Yeah, so we need science, we need technology. I think we said before, we need carbon capture and storage as part of a portfolio of technologies. We need to act now, because what needs to happen if you want to reach net zero is that the emissions need to decrease. We have seen that last year emissions were the same as the previous year. We hope that's a peak, but we can underestimate the challenges of decarbonizing an energy system while guaranteeing access to energy and reliability of energy.
Absolutely extraordinary.
All of these options.
Thank you so much, each and every one of you. And I suppose the amazing thing is that so many brilliant people are thinking about this and making, if you like, lots of little steps which equate to perhaps, one hopes, some very big steps overall. And perhaps in 15, 20 years' time, we'll be talking about this as though it is the norm. From me, David Foster, from my guest, listen, thank you so much. I found that absolutely fascinating. We thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable, and we hope to have your company next time. For now, goodbye.